When it comes to program design, it's often said that specificity is king. In this video, I want to talk to you about how that isn't always the case and the very important role that variety plays in your training program. Firstly, what is specificity? Specificity is a training principle that suggests that our training should, as best as possible, replicate the demands expected of us in our sport. Closely tied with specificity is the SAID principle, which asserts that the human body will adapt in a very specific way in order to better tolerate any stresses imposed on us in the future. A good example of this is, let's say you're exposed to an ultraviolet stress. Your body will adapt by tanning. Now, more specifically, the skin that was exposed to the ultraviolet stress is what will tan. If you're wearing a singlet, your shoulders and arms will tan, but your torso will not because it wasn't stressed. This is an example of the very specific nature of adaptation. Now, closely tied with adaptation and specificity is the idea of transfer. Transfer is a principle that says that adaptations that we receive due to one type of stress will have carryover or will also have benefit when we are faced with other types of stress that are of similar nature or that have some sort of crossover or carryover. Let's say, for example, you train the back squat. Back squatting will make you better at back squatting more than anything else. In fact, it is the most specific thing you can do if you want to improve your back squat, that is the back squat. But it will also have transfer to other challenges or other demands that aren't back squatting. So a program that has lots of back squatting will or should improve your front squat. A program that has lots of back squatting will probably improve your leg press because, again, there's some sort of carryover there. And a program that has a lot of back squatting might improve your running or your ability to run because there is some crossover. However, a program that has a lot of back squatting won't improve your ability to tolerate UV stress because there is no carryover, there's no crossover between those two demands. Now, on the other end of the spectrum is this idea of variety. Variety is a training principle that suggests that our training should, at times, be far removed from the demands expected of us in our sport. It suggests that our training shouldn't replicate the demands in our sport. It is the opposite of specificity. Now, if our body adapts in a very specific way, why then would we want to train in a way that was considered unspecific? Why would we want to adapt to things that seem irrelevant? Well, there's a number of reasons that I want to go through with you today. The first thing you need to understand is that if we were to train in a way that truly adhered to the idea of specificity, we would literally be maxing out our squat, then bench press, then deadlift in every workout. We'd be wearing our competition equipment, so our soft suits and our knee sleeves and our wrist straps and our squat shoes. We would be lifting on competition equipment. We would be training at the same time of day we would expect to compete. We would ideally have referees adjudicating our sets. We would have a crowd watching our lifts. You know, this is truly adhering to specificity. So this suggests that competing is actually the most specific thing we can do, which is true. However, it's obvious that we don't train like that, and there's a number of reasons why we don't. The first is practicality. It's simply impractical to max out all three lifts under those circumstances. It takes too long. We can't really expect people to sit in a crowd, in our training sessions to simulate what it would be like in a competition. It's just unreasonable. So the first reason is impracticality. The second reason is injury mitigation. Maxing out all three lifts in the same workout multiple times per week carries with it a really high degree of risk of injury. And it's one that most coaches probably aren't willing to take. The risk to reward ratio simply isn't there. The third reason is boredom. The reason we train is for fun. That's the most common reason why we choose to train and pursue strength. It's enjoyable. But if we're training in the same way, if we're always maxing out our lifts, hitting heavy singles in all three lifts in every workout all the time, it quickly becomes very boring. And training like this is not enjoyable, and that boredom will present itself by decreasing training quality, and it's just not a practical way to train. However, there are a number of really important reasons why you need to include variety in your training program, and that's what I want to go through with you today. The first reason is due to this idea called the repeated bout effect. Now, the repeated bout effect is a phenomena that says that the more we are exposed to a certain type of stimulus, the less of a response we will have to that stimulus. So a really good example of this is how we respond to caffeine. The more caffeine you take, the more caffeine you need to take in order to receive the same benefit or the same effect. Training stimuli behaves in a really similar way. The more of a certain type of training we do, the more of that same type of training we need to do in order to receive the same response or same effect. If you take caffeine and you are desensitized to caffeine, what's a really easy way to resensitize yourself to caffeine again? Of course, take time off caffeine. Spend a couple of weeks or a week away from caffeine, so when you go back to caffeine, you get a response again, right? You actually start to feel it again. If your training is such that you really aren't getting much of a response from your training, if you feel like you are somewhat plateaued and it's simply not having the same effect it used to, it might be worthwhile considering taking some time off training or time off that type of training. If you take time off caffeine, it's really difficult. You might be more sluggish and tired and you might be less productive, but there are ways you can cope with that. For example, you can get more sleep and eat better food. In the same way, if we take time off training or if we take time off specific style training, then we're going to potentially lose strength. But you can mitigate that by training in other ways, training in non-specific ways, training in ways that will have carryover and transfer, but also have a blend of variety amongst it. So for example, you might take 2 weeks off the competition lifts and replace that with non-specific lifts, the overhead press, the front squat, opposite stance deadlifts. In this time, you are going to resensitize to the training stimulus and you're going to null or void the effect of the repeated bout effect. So when you go back to the training stimulus or when you go back to the competition lifts, you will receive a positive benefit. You will actually start to see an effect again. A great example of the repeated bout effect is what happens with some people's bench press. So for example, the bench press is a lift that's often slow to progress, and it's also one that recovers really easily. So what some people do is they program really high amounts of volume and high amounts of frequency, 4 to 5 sessions per week on the bench for 5 to 6 working sets per session. And what ends up happening over time is that we get so desensitized to that training, so the training response is so blunted that we actually dig ourselves into a really deep repeated bout effect scenario. We're not getting any progress. We're really heavily plateaued. What I recommend doing during this period is actually taking time off the bench press, spending 4 or 5 weeks focusing on variance, overhead press, incline bench press, dumbbells, isolation work. Lifts or exercises that are going to maintain our conditioning, that are going to have some transfer, but also an opportunity to resensitize to the training stimulus of the bench press. So when we go back to a training program that has the bench press in it, we're actually resensitized. We actually can get a response and we can start moving forward and away from that plateau. The second reason why you want to incorporate an element of variety in your program is injury prevention or chronic injury prevention. This can be a bit of a contentious issue, so I want to explain this a little bit further. If we train the same lifts all the time, we put ourselves at high risk of chronic injury or overuse style injuries by doing the same movements again and again and again for years on end. A great way to curb this is by doing variants or variations of the lift or movements that are slightly different, that challenge ourselves in different ways, that move us through different ranges of motion. Now, there are going to be some people that argue that by doing the same lifts again and again, we will adapt and we'll actually be at a decreased risk of injury in the future by doing those same repetitive movements, because our body's adapted, right? We're used to those movements, so we're less likely to get injured. However, this hasn't really been proven or, studied enough, and it's probably not worth the risk in training that way. So instead, it's better to train in a way where we blend in some sort of variety. We do different lifts, we do different movements, and it's in your interest to become a well-rounded athlete. Now, you don't need to be as conditioned as a marathon runner. You don't need to be as muscularly conditioned as a gymnast or as flexible as a ballet dancer. But if you want to be as strong as possible, it is in your interest to be fit, muscularly conditioned, physically resilient to injury, well-rounded, and coordinated. Now, I'm not trying to argue that specificity is a bad thing, and there are many programs that are very successful that are based around high amounts of specificity, like the Bulgarian squat routine. In fact, most of my programming is also very highly specific. And I don't want to swing the pendulum too far the other way and say that you need to incorporate heaps of variety and heaps of accessories in your program. All I'm simply trying to suggest is that having some deliberate amounts of variety in your program is a really great way to coax long-term progress. Let's take a look at the Bulgarian squat routine. It has you hitting heavy squat singles pretty much every day or even twice a day. This program yields really great response or really great results in the short term, and it has, you've seen people hit 20 kilo, 30 kilo PBs in only 8 weeks, for example. And this is due to the very highly specific nature of the program. However, after this period, after the initial 8, 10 or 12 weeks, your training response to that type of stimulus is heavily blunted as per the repeated bout effect. Trying to coax more progress in the future is very difficult because you're so conditioned, you're so desensitized to that style of training, and that it can be hard to initiate progress again. This is why highly specific programs aren't exactly a very valuable tool to be used in the long term. Now, there are many variables that we can manipulate in order to include variety in our training program. let's take a look at the low bar back squat as an example. The competition lift has us wearing knee sleeves or potentially knee wraps, soft suit, squat shoes, with the bar low on our back if you squat with a low bar, and hitting heavy singles, 95% intensity or above for 1 rep. Ways that we can incorporate variety into this is quite simple. We can do more than 3 sets or less than 3 sets. We can lift intensities that aren't 95 to 100%. You know, we can hit 70% or 80%. We can shift where the bar sits instead of a low bar. It can be a high bar or a front squat, or we can even change the bar into a safety squat bar or a cambered bar. We can widen our stance, narrow our stance. We can incorporate tempo infinitely with infinite permutations. We can go down across 2 seconds, across 3 seconds, across 8 seconds. We can pause in the hole for 1 second, 2 seconds, 5 seconds. We can pause midway up if we wish. The ways that we can vary our lifts is enormous, and failing to take advantage of all these variables would be unwise. Now, there's a number of ways you can implement variety amongst your training program. The first is to take specific periods off the competition lift. So I'm talking 4, 5, 6 weeks away from the competition lift. As an example, again, using the low bar back squat, you might replace that in your program with the high bar beltless squat. A lift that's going to have transfer to the competition style squat, but one that's also variable enough to give us a period of time where we can resensitize to the low bar squat. So you might spend 4 or 5 weeks doing the high bar back squat as your main squat variant. And in this time, we're going to be strengthening that movement because it's probably one that you're not very familiar with. Then when you go back to the low bar style squat, you're going to be resensitized to that training, and you're actually going to start to see a strength stimulus again. You're actually going to start seeing some progress again. Another way you can incorporate variety into your program is through pivot weeks. This is something that Mike Teixeira of RTS has kind of developed. Basically, a pivot week is a deload style week. A week where you train in a way that's very unspecific. You might do sets of 10, 12, and 15 instead of doubles and triples. You might do lift variants. So instead of the low bar squat, you might do the front squat, you might do the overhead press, you might do the opposite stance deadlift for high reps again. And during this week, the idea is to challenge ourselves in different ways, but also give us a break from the repetitive nature of the competition lifts. And then when we go back to the competition lift, we are again resensitized to that style of training, and we actually get a bit of a response in the next training block. The last way that you can incorporate variety is quite simple, and that is to have a high and healthy amount of variety amongst your training program all year round, especially in off-season style blocks. So let's say you squat 3 days per week. You could be squatting once per week as a competition style, once per week with a safety bar, and once per week as a front squat, for example. This way, you're still training the competition lift once per week, and you're still getting a lot of squat volume, a lot of volume through your legs, but in a non-specific way, you know, training variations that are slightly different to challenge weaknesses, to bring up weak points, and to also keep us, keep our training from getting stale and keep us sensitive to the training stimulus. I hope you found this video useful and you've taken something important away, and you better understand the idea between and the relationship between specificity, variety, transfer, and a long-term successful powerlifting program. If you've got any questions, please leave them in the comment section below. And if you've got any comments or if you've got any ideas to share, please again leave them in the comment section below. Thanks for watching.